morning from Surrey, England. I'm Paul Gardner and I'm here to tell you all about the rewilding that took place in the Eastern Cape of South Africa back in the early 1990s when Dad and his team started to re-establish the wildlands of this particular region. It was a fascinating journey. I was at boarding school with my younger brother Murray, and we were in Grahamstown at a place called St Andrews, and not far from the game reserve where all of this action was taking place. And it was a real privilege and an honor to have been able to experience what Dad and his team were doing. The only other people in the world that were rewilding at the time were Yellowstone National Park, and they were bringing back the bears and the wolves. So a fascinating time. Rewilding wasn't really a word that was often thrown around. But Dad and his team had a lot of naysayers. The local farmers said, you know, what the hell are you doing bringing back all these animals that were shot out by our great-grandparents? And they brag about how their great-grandfather shot the last black rhino in 1879, for instance. Anyway, Dad, being as resilient as he always is, just forged ahead, and the animals started to arrive. And the first to arrive were 5 baby elephants from the Kruger National Park. And what they were doing in Kruger was they had a huge abundance of elephants. It was a problem, and they were eating them out of house and home, and they actually had to shoot thousands of elephants each year and control the numbers. And they would tackle a family unit at a time, and the family unit would get wiped out, and the baby elephants would be translocated to places like Shamwari. So we ended up with these 5 babies. They arrived, they were put in a big boma, and a boma is a special place for these elephants to acclimatize. They learn about the electric fencing, so that when they are released, they don't fiddle with the main fence. And it's just them getting used to the area. And they were settled in and then ultimately released. At the same time, pockets of babies arrived at a big national park north of Johannesburg called Pilanesberg. And so they ended up with a bunch of babies. But what was starting to happen was these babies would turn into real little rogues and delinquents, and they would charge around chasing vehicles and doing all kinds of crazy stuff. And they started to notice a lot of rhino deaths in the Pilanesberg, and they put it down to poaching. But it was subsequently found out that the elephants were coming into must very early, so the young bulls were becoming sexually mature too early, and they would just run amok and started killing rhinos. And we at Shamwari had grown our herd. Another bunch of babies arrived. This story is quite a harsh one, but they traveled down from Kruger National Park again. They traveled through a small town beyond Johannesburg, and it was very misty, and the driver managed to turn the whole truck over, and suddenly all these young elephants managed to escape, and they were running around this little town outside of Johannesburg, and they had to gather them all up anyway. They all ended up back at Shamwari, but we were facing similar issues. You know, Ellies were chasing vehicles around. I remember I was a game ranger at the time, and I've got this great picture of Big Bear, one of the bigger elephants. He was in must chasing everybody around that day, and suddenly he appeared and my vehicle broke down, and I was literally eye to eye with this big bull. But frightening times. And so what was eventually established by the scientists was, because the social makeup of an elephant herd is very similar to that of a human family, is if you take out the parents, you've got to replace them with somebody else, otherwise the kids run amok. And so it was figured out that we needed to bring in a whole family unit, from the greatest big matriarch all the way down to the younger bulls, to whack these youngsters into place. And so that's what happened. And we did the first ever pioneering translocation of a whole family unit of elephants down to the Eastern Cape of South Africa. And they arrived in the early 90s. I'll never forget it. This great big herd, all the youngsters came off, and then the young bulls came off, and they were all sitting in this boma. And of course the last to come off was this huge matriarch. None of us had ever seen an elephant that size arriving in the Eastern Cape. And the boma poles are big telephone poles. I mean, they are sturdy old things, and they popped into the ground and they concreted in, and they're wired together with cables, and there's electricity and everything. And as I said, they stay there for a month. Now this matriarch came into the boma, and I think she could look over the boma like this. That's how tall she was. And she started to put her forehead against the boma, and she started to rock against it. And the whole thing came crashing down like toothpicks. And of course we had about 100 media and guests watching the spectacle of this first big herd arriving at Shamwari. and they scattered. I'll never forget it. People were climbing trees, hiding under cars, running to the lodges. It was absolute mayhem, and this herd of elephants, I think we were about 14 or 15 of them, just went careering out of this boma, and they headed to the main boundary fence of the reserve. And of course, we were all on high alert. I remember we raced up a hill to go and see what was going on, and we could see this big matriarch. She put her great big tusks under the electric fence, put it under her tusks, and ripped the whole thing over. It went flying over her head, and the rest of the herd followed her out the reserve into the neighboring farm. It was mayhem. The helicopters were in the sky trying to get them back, and we just watched this whole thing unfold. The trials and tribulations of rewilding are never easy. So what happened that evening was we managed to lure the rest of the herd back into the reserve and patched up the hole in the fence. But of course the matriarch carried on running, and her little calf, her youngest little calf, probably a 3 or 4 year old, followed her. They went crashing through 70 farm fences along the way. They crossed the N2, which is our big national road. They continued as far as they could to the sand dunes of Port Elizabeth, and they could see the city from there, and they couldn't go any further because they'd reached the bay. And we had tracked them that whole night, and we got hold of them the next morning. We came across the carcass of a cow. She had killed a cow on the way, great big holes in this cow. And we eventually got James Thompson, a great big friend, put his hand up and said, listen, you've got my helicopter for the day. Let me come and help you. And we eventually tracked her down. We darted her from the helicopter, laid her down on a flatbed truck, and we got her back to Shamwari later that evening. The calf, on the other hand, we eventually found. We darted her, and there was no ways we could, the bush was so impenetrable where she was, and so we couldn't get a truck in there to load her up. So we actually had to wake her up again and try and chase her closer to an access point, and then dart her again and get her on a truck back to Shamwari. But what happened was, when we woke her up, this little youngster ran amok. She was terrified. And I'd never forget, this big bloke arrived and he said, guys, I'm here to help you. I hear you got a problem with an elephant. And he was a big burly rugby player guy. And he said, great, come, we're walking the bush here and we're just trying to find her, and we'll be ready with the dart gun. If you hear her, please. And about half an hour into this, we heard this screaming voice. It sounded like a young kid absolutely going berserk. And I thought, oh God, the elephant's fallen into a hole, or it's stuck in barbed wire fence or whatever. And it ended up being this big Afrikaans boy, and he came stumbling out the bushes, spitting grass out of his mouth. And this elephant calf had absolutely pummeled this guy, a 3-year-old calf. I couldn't believe what an elephant of that size could do to a man of that size. This poor guy had cuts and scratches, and he'd run through thorn trees, but this elephant had absolutely drilled him into the ground. So it just shows you the power of a young elephant. Anyway, we got the calf back to Shamwari. This is where the sad side of the story starts, because now you've got an elephant who knows how to break out of a reserve. And my father wasn't around at the time. He was in the UK on a business trip. And I remember Dr. Jan Jaber had to phone him and say, listen, Adrian, we've got a problem here. This elephant knows how to break out. She's going to do it again. What do we do? And we had to make a really sad decision of actually putting her to sleep that night. I'll never forget that. It was a very, very sad moment. This great big elephant had come on this massive journey, gone through this whole experience, and then we had to put her to sleep. Such is the nature of rewilding. It just shows you what happens behind the scenes. It's a very, very tough business. And I take my hat off to all those guys that are involved in it, because it's tough.
We are born from this world.